Picture this for a moment. The year is 36 BC. 35,000 soldiers of the mighty fallen empire march across the edge of the known world, dust clinging to their armor, banners snapping in the wind. They arrive before a remote fortress near the Talas River, so far west that even the emperor's maps grow vague and uncertain. At first glance, it looks like just another barbarian stronghold. But then something feels wrong. The walls don't match. The defenses don't make sense. And when the gates open, what steps out will shatter everything history thought it knew. Because standing there, on the far edge of China, are soldiers moving in perfect unison, locking shields, forming a disciplined square that no nomad on earth should know how to make. A Roman formation. 17 years after an entire Roman army vanished without a trace. This is the story of Rome's lost legion, and how it may have died in China. To understand how something this impossible could even happen, we have to rewind nearly 2 decades earlier, back to one of the most catastrophic days in Roman military history. In 53 BC, Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest men who ever lived, decided that wealth wasn't enough. He wanted glory. Pompey had it. Caesar was chasing it, and Crassus believed he could seize it by conquering the Parthian Empire. Against wiser advice, he led 7 Roman legions, more than 40,000 elite soldiers, deep into the deserts near the city of Carrhae. This wasn't a war for Rome's survival. It was a personal gamble, driven by ego and ambition. Waiting for him was a force that, on paper, looked laughably small. The Parthian general Serena commanded only around 10,000 men, but they were specialists. 9,000 horse archers could fire with deadly accuracy while riding at full speed, and 1,000 cataphracts, heavily armored cavalry that looked more like living tanks than men. Crassus outnumbered them 4-1. He believed sheer mass would win the day. He was wrong. From the moment the battle began, the Romans were trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. The Parthians refused close combat. They circled endlessly, loosing wave after wave of arrows. When the legions advanced, the cavalry simply retreated, firing backward with the infamous Parthian shot. Roman shields grew heavy, arms trembled. The desert sun burned overhead as water ran out, and men collapsed where they stood. Hours passed. The arrows never stopped, and when the Roman lines finally began to buckle, the cataphracts charged. 1,000 armored riders smashed into exhausted infantry, and formations that had conquered the Mediterranean shattered in the sand. By nightfall, the disaster was complete. Around 20,000 Romans lay dead. Another 10,000 escaped west, carrying word of the catastrophe back to Rome. But roughly 10,000 soldiers, an entire legion's worth, were captured alive. Their sacred eagle standards were taken. Crassus himself was killed during a parley, his head severed and sent east as a trophy. In a single afternoon, Rome lost an army, a general, and its pride. But history goes strangely quiet about one question. What happened to those 10,000 prisoners? Ancient writers barely whisper about their fate. The poet Horace mocked them, claiming they lived on in shame, married to barbarian wives and serving foreign kings. But no Roman army ever came back. No prisoner exchange. No mass execution recorded. 10,000 of the best trained infantry on earth simply vanished. The Parthians, however, faced a serious problem. These men weren't useless captives. They were highly trained legionaries, masters of discipline, siegecraft, and heavy infantry tactics. Killing them would waste a priceless military asset. but keeping them near Rome's borders was dangerous. These men knew Roman strategy. They would defect at the first chance. So the Parthians made a calculated decision. According to later Roman sources, including Pliny the Elder, the captives were sent east, very far east, to Margiana, near the city of Merv, thousands of kilometers from Rome. Beyond any hope of rescue, there, on the edge of the Central Asian world, the Romans faded from history. For 17 years, they guarded trade routes, defended oases, and lived as soldiers for an empire not their own. They married local women. I had children, adapted, changed, but they never forgot how to fight. Then the world shifted again. By 36 BC, a powerful Xiongnu leader named xiongnu had lost a civil war against his own brother and fled west. He needed a fortress. He needed soldiers, and somewhere along the Parthian frontier were hardened infantry who knew how to hold walls, form disciplined ranks, and fight to the last man. The Romans were rented out, absorbed into Xiongnu's forces, and transported even farther east, toward a destiny no one could have imagined. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of Asia, a desperate and brilliant man was rising. Chen Tang was not born into privilege. He was poor, mocked, buried in debt. At one point, he survived by borrowing money and begging. But what he lacked in status, he made up for in raw intelligence. He knew the western frontier like no one else. Every trade route, every tribal rivalry, every weakness. When reports arrived that Gigi had built a fortress deep in Kangju territory, most officials hesitated. The distance alone was terrifying. Over 5,000 kilometers from the Han capital, a march that crossed deserts that swallowed armies and mountains that killed with altitude and cold. But Chen Tang saw an opportunity. He realized that Gigi was isolated, hated by local nobles, and overconfident behind his walls. So he made a decision that should have ended his career or his life. Rather than wait months for imperial approval, Chen Tang forged an edict in the emperor's name. He began mobilizing troops across the western regions, conscripting soldiers from allied city-states and frontier garrisons. When his superior hesitated, Chen Tang confronted him, sword in hand, and declared that the arrow was already on the bowstring. There was no turning back. An army of 40,000 men assembled, 10,000 elite Han soldiers and 30,000 auxiliaries. They marched in 2 columns, crossing deserts and mountain passes, enforcing strict discipline. No looting, no brutality. This restraint won over local rulers who despised Xiongnu's cruelty. Supplies flowed. Intelligence poured in. By the time Xiongnu realized what was happening, the Han army was already closing in. When the Han forces finally arrived at the fortress, even their seasoned commanders were stunned. The defenses were unlike anything they had seen. An inner earthen wall, typical of Central Asia, but outside it stood a wooden palisade built from interlocking logs, something completely alien to nomadic construction. Colorful banners flew from the walls. Hundreds of armored soldiers manned the battlements. Then came the moment that would echo through history. First, 100 Xiongnu cavalry rode out, galloping back and forth in a familiar display of intimidation. But then, behind them, another 100 soldiers emerged. Infantry. They formed up on either side of the gate, shields locking together. Their movements were precise, mechanical, disciplined. They drilled calmly in full view of the enemy. The Han chronicles describe it as a fish-scale formation, but modern historians know exactly what that was. A testudo, a Roman formation adapted for defense. Nomads didn't fight like this. They didn't drill like this. Only Roman legionaries were trained to perform such calculated displays under pressure. The battle that followed was brutal and short. Chen Tang ordered his crossbowmen forward, and the air filled with bolts. The Roman trained infantry and xiongnu cavalry withdrew behind the walls. War drums thundered as the Han army attacked from every direction. Crossbow fire wiped out defenders on the earthen wall. The wooden stockade was set ablaze. At night, desperate cavalry charges were annihilated in storms of bolts. Gigi himself fought on the walls, alongside his wives and concubines, arrows striking his face as flames consumed his fortress. By dawn, it was over. Han soldiers stormed the city. Street fighting erupted. Gigi retreated to his palace, where he made his last stand before being cut down and beheaded. He became the only xiongnu supreme ruler ever killed by Han forces. When the counting ended, 1,518 defenders lay dead. 145 were captured alive. Those survivors almost certainly included the last of Rome's lost legion. 17 years after Carrhae, after crossing half the world, not dying in Roman colors, but fighting under foreign banners, against an empire they had never even known existed. Chen Tang's victory made him famous, and nearly destroyed him. He was honored, stripped of rank, imprisoned, and reinstated again. But his legacy endured, a reminder that discipline, logistics, and daring could shatter even the most distant enemies. And somewhere in that distant fortress, Roman shields fell under Chinese crossbows, a silent collision between the greatest infantry the West ever produced and the most advanced military machine of the East. So here's the question. If you were commanding those final Roman survivors, staring down 40,000 Han soldiers, what would you have done? Held the testudo until the end? Or ordered a desperate breakout into the unknown? Let me know what you think. And if you want more stories where empires collide at the edge of history, make sure you're subscribed.